Amid the ideological madness and hysteria besieging the West in recent years, the approach which has been emanating from Hungary comes as a breath of fresh air.
Its approach to immigration, patriotic cultural programs and promotion of the traditional family have angered much of the establishment elites in our own countries. But how has Hungary remained steadfast in the face of demonization? How successful are these policies? And as the country faces its general election next month, what can we in Western Europe and America learn from Hungary in restoring our culture, institutions, and indeed our politics?
If one wants to comprehend the politics of Hungary, one has to be aware of the events that have shaped this nation's psyche. It is the history of a distinct Central European people with their own unique language, constantly fending off invaders and having their identity and agency suppressed by various occupiers for more or less 500 years. The most recent of these occupations being Soviet Russia. The post-war Soviet occupation of Hungary was brutal, killing hundreds of thousands in the purging of Hungarian citizens, leaders and intellectuals, as well as the suppression of rallies held in defiance of the occupation. The communist era ended in 1989 with the creation of the Third Republic, and it was against this oppressive background that the Conservative Party Fidesz was formed.
Orbán and Fidesz, Hungary's ruling party, are often accused of building an authoritarian state. This overstates both the extent of their political control and their ideological ambitions. The Hungarian Prime Minister is best understood as a conservative institutionalist who seeks to seize the commanding heights of Hungarian society by influencing the country's key organizations and cultural bodies.
In pursuit of this goal, Orbán is unabashed, disregarding globalist norms all too common in Western Europe. I know that you were one of the founding fathers of Fidesz in the 1980s. Looking back and looking as well to the future, because there's an election coming, would you say that the strength of the appeal of Fidesz is in cultural issues more than economic?
It's a very interesting question. In 1988, when we have established Fidesz, we had communism, we had the Soviet Union, we had the Gorbachev, we had Nicolae Ceausescu in the neighborhood, Erich Honecker, and János Kádár. At that time, it was a protest against communism when the party was created. And I tell you honestly that we didn't even dream about free elections. And now we are accused that these elections are not going to be free. It is going to be free because we know what the value of freedom is. But I would say that it was a very complex protest, but the appeal was in the first instance cultural of Fidesz. And we said to the Hungarians, stand up. And in 1990, by the time when transition started, let's back our independence and sovereignty. And when we are independent and sovereign, which in our history was not a very regular experience, because we had the Turks, we had the Habsburgs, then we have the Soviet Union, but now we are enjoying it for 30 years. It is a great value to us, as big as to the British people, their sovereignty, independence, sovereignty, identity, nationhood are the key appealing words what we are communicating, what we are representing, and what people like. And yes, it has primarily an attitude. It is an attitude.
If one were to take a cursory look at Western media, one would be forgiven for thinking that Viktor Orbán was head of an authoritarian regime. But in reality, Hungarian conservative thinking has always been about the preservation of the country's sovereignty and freedom in the face of threatening forces, from whatever direction and in whatever form they may come.
Well, it's to do, I mean, this is, you know, the demonization is more to do with Viktor Orbán rather than Hungary itself. I mean, I'm going to simplify this because it's a bit more complicated than this, but essentially a lot of it is quite simply down to, I'd say, political spite. Orbán is, you know, a right-wing prime minister, and this goes back a long way, even to the sort of, I'd say, the mid-1990s, that the former communists started spreading the rumour. They went to people in Brussels and Washington and sort of whispered in their ears, well, unfortunately, he's far right, he's an anti-Semite. And none of this is true. But unfortunately, the European left seem to love the idea of having a sort of fascist to castigate and vilify. So he's had an extremely unfair and unjust press. I mean, even The Guardian regularly runs columns where people describe Orbán as a dictator, which is just, it's like calling Boris Johnson a dictator. I mean, every politician has their flaws and shortcomings, but he's a democratically elected prime minister, and you know that's that. But unfortunately, Hungary has, I think, you know, had a bad reputation because people have been attacking Orbán.
Do you see that intensifying?
Well, I think if, the next general election is on April the 3rd. You know, it's not clear what the result will be because, for all sorts of reasons, it's a more unsettled picture. So, essentially, almost anything could happen. It's perfectly possible that the opposition could win. Equally, it's perfectly possible that Orbán may end up with still a quite large majority. My guess would be he will win, but with a small majority. And of course, when that happens, you know, the international left will convulse in rage because they'll think it was fixed. Whereas no one has actually questioned the election process. The observers, the OSCE who come along, they came along last time. They had a few minor complaints about the fact that Hungarian politics is a sort of boys' club, which is true. But that was it, and they're coming this time. And in fact, the EU wants to send lots more people here to observe the elections. And I think on their part it's a mistake because their observers will find that it's all run properly. So when Orbán wins, if he does, they can't say it's fixed.
Actually, yes. I mean, as well, when I was saying it about intensifying, I was always thinking on a more general level that as well is that one of the reasons maybe for this demonization is that the priorities of Orbán in Hungary just conflict entirely with the overriding Western.
It's as I say. I think essentially it was the European left wanting to have a go at him, and they used the apparat, the machinery of the EU to do this. So that was the start of it. Now I think, you know, some of Orbán's policies may be driven partly to annoy people in the EU as a sort of riposte to that. But also, when the EU enlarged, I think the French and the Germans, who seemed very keen on getting in the countries of sort of Central Europe, still want to actually tell them what to do. There's still, you know, a lot of sort of bossiness from the French and the Germans. And Orbán isn't someone who likes to be pushed around. He's a very independent-minded man who had a very tough time, had quite a tough time sort of setting up a political organisation under communism. When Fidesz started, it was far from obvious what the result would be. I mean, he did actually risk his neck for democracy.
Well, it's demonized because I think it represents a society which we all of us remember from the societies in which we grew up, in which the government is not particularly interested in your ideas. It lets you get on with life. It is in the old-fashioned sense of live and let live. It is liberal. And that's true for conservative governments in the past as well. What you now have is governments which really constantly examine their subjects' morality and want to actually change this morality and persuade them to adopt another one. I don't think the Hungarian government, for example, has the slightest interest in whether you go to church on Sunday, and if so, which church you go to.
Right.
But they do think that the traditional morality and religious views of the Hungarian people, and there are lots of these views, deserve the respect of the law and of international law and organizations. I don't think that the Hungarian government, I'm not talking about just this government, but most governments at the present here, we had a communist period. They did care, and they did instruct, rule, constantly monitor the opinions of their subjects to make sure that they fitted the prescribed communist point of view. That's why people here don't like that. They remember it. They remember it's easier for them to connect the kind of instructions that are issued by Brussels and by modern governments in countries like France and Germany to their citizens, or easier for them to connect that with the kind of oppressive government that they had under the communists. Because remember, communism wasn't simply oppression, it was oppression plus preaching. And you had to sort of affirm things which you knew to be false because they were the doctrine of the ruling party. And we're beginning to find that, aren't we, in the woke revolution, where people get fired from jobs because they don't have the correct view on something. They won't affirm what's regarded as the correct view. And that's why in this country, they look at other countries and they say, we're freer. And of course, they look at America and they see the woke university transmitting not the traditional values of society, but a repudiation of them, coupled with what looked like the old ideas of the communists, which led to such moral disaster and to the moral vacuum in their own societies. So here you will find quite interesting criticisms of the woke world that they see on the other side of Europe and in America. When they look at this and say, that's the kind of thing we're used to hear from the communist government.
The accusation is often that Hungary is somehow anti-immigrant, whereas, as we've seen with the crisis in Ukraine, they are more than willing to take genuine refugees from a neighbouring country. The distinction is between legal and illegal, of genuine asylum and economic migration. The effectiveness of Hungary's chosen methods of dealing with illegal immigration cannot be questioned. In 2015, Hungary built a barrier on its border with Serbia and Croatia. The fence was constructed during the European migrant crisis with the aim of ensuring border security by preventing illegal immigrants from entering. By the completion of this fence in November of 2015, the average daily number of intercepted migrants decreased to just 15, which was a daily reduction of more than 4,500.
Well, of course, a lot of the people who denounced, in Europe, who denounced the government here, Mr. Orbán, as a fascist and so on, over his decision to actually to follow European Union rules and insist that people entering the first country they came to in the EU would have to be properly registered, which, of course, many of the asylum seekers were not willing to do because they didn't want to stay in Hungary. They wanted to go to Sweden or to Germany. So actually the very first thing that he did, which started the crisis, so to speak, following Angela Merkel's inviting everybody to Europe, the very first thing he did was following the rules, which she had not done. She was inviting people to come to Europe. The Dublin rules suggested that they should go to one European country and there register, whichever European country they happened to come to first, so to speak. So what was interesting was that the establishment lined up to attack Orbán because he was in fact following their own rules. And subsequently, of course, they all adopted the policy that he had advocated, including people who'd strongly denounced him. So that's why, I mean, that's one reason why there is resentment, I think.
In 2018, Hungary's government introduced legislation known as the Stop Soros laws, named after the Hungarian-American billionaire George Soros, whose pro-migrant and open border stance, facilitated by his Open Society Foundation, is well documented. The laws, drafted by Prime Minister Orbán, created a new category of crime called promoting and supporting illegal migration, banning individuals and organizations from providing any kind of assistance to undocumented immigrants. In November 2021, the European Court of Justice ruled that Hungary had violated EU law by restricting access to asylum and criminalizing assistance to asylum seekers.
We maintain that if there's need for migration, so you need your population to refresh, we can live with that. We can accept that there are countries around the globe that are going to rely on that. Or if you need migration for labor purposes, and that is to refresh and extend your labor market, we can live with that. But we claim and we believe that nobody can decide instead of you. So it's only the Hungarians, the Hungarian government, who can decide whether we would like to follow that path or we would like to go a different direction. I believe this is the essence of the debate and what is behind the quarrel with the European institutions. Mm-hmm. The Brussels institutions are representing a Western European perception of migration. They are not simply liberal and apologetic, but they are irresponsible when they claim that what is happening at the European borders is right. And very conscientiously, obviously, they mix up asylum seekers who are fleeing for their lives, fleeing for political or war or any other reason, actually, in their countries. They mix it up with economic migrants who only come to Europe and to come to different parts of the Western world, hoping a better life for the future. Irregulated migration is dangerous because it's putting a big pressure on societies.
This was quite thoroughgoing. So, for example, the chances of Hungary getting a huge immigration industry are pretty slim, are they not?
Because we resist. So it's not by chance. We see the efforts, not only by the European institutions, but increasingly by so-called NGOs, and that is non-governmental organizations who clearly are not representing any human rights or international rights perspective, but a different kind of business, maybe political interest. And we resist that. So that's why we have built a fence. That's why we have introduced tougher measures at the borders. And that's why we have introduced a more extensive personnel on the ground, actually. This is the threefold measure system, actually, by which we try to ensure that we minimize the numbers who come through the Hungarian borders. You have to know that Hungary, when defending, say, the Hungarian-Serbian border, where we have a fence, is not only defending itself, but is defending the European Union. In face of that, we hear and see claims that we are going against human rights, and we are not democratic. We have a big and unending quarrel with the European institutions regarding that, but we are unrelenting. So we are not going to give this up because we have a mandate for that from the Hungarian people.
In 1981, Hungary's population peaked at 10.7 million. At the beginning of this year, it was estimated to be 9.73 million. Every year for 40 years, more Hungarians have died than were born. But rather than look to immigration to solve this problem, the Hungarian government decided to incentivize the growth of families from within. While the hostility to the traditional family continues to wreak havoc in the United States and the countries of Western Europe, Hungary has pursued a pro-family agenda which is reaping a bountiful harvest. In the 2021 budget, 7.52 billion euros were allocated to family support, or 5.2% of GDP. In 2020, there were 92,233 births, which was 3.4% up from 2019. a direct consequence of the pro-family legislation passed in that year, as well as a 50% increase in the number of marriages. This resurrection of the traditional family has been helped by the government's proactive pro-family policies, such as the grant of around 26,000 for married couples who have at least 3 children. Orbán has said he wants the fertility rate to hit 2.1 by 2030, the figure at which a population can replace itself, but it is a tall order and no country in Europe is anywhere near this.
When we have established a flat tax with the family allowance, and step by step, year by year, we've been adding to the family policies to the extent that today the Hungarian family allowance, family support system is probably the most extensive one in Europe, reaching beyond 5% of the GDP per year. So it's a series of decisions, a series of measures, benefits that are preferring the very basic and unique block of society, and that is the family. Demography crisis is not new in Europe. It's been us for decades, or rather generations. And we wanted to demonstrate, and I believe our family policies is a demonstration of that, that it is possible to have a different approach than what most of Western Europe or the Western world is constituting. And that is, pro-family is meaning that in face of the declining, the negative population tendencies you see, negative demography tendencies, it is possible to make a turn. And that is provide the ground, provide the circumstances in which there can be families, classical families, and there can be more kids born. So instead of relying, as more increasingly most of Western Europe is doing, on external migration, and that is non-European migration by today, to be able to meet your demography and population challenges, we have chosen a different way. And I believe the numbers we see, an increasing number of marriages, a declining number of divorces, an increasing number of kids born, are a good sign that indeed 12 years effort behind us, and the consistent, as I suggested earlier, the consistent effort, year by year, one by one, can have results like that.
We shouldn't exaggerate their success. They don't. They make it plain that reversing a long time downward trend of fertility is something that is going to take more than one generation, and we have to acknowledge, we have to realize that. And I agree. I think this is fundamentally the overall policy is the right policy. Getting it right technically will take some time, but they are right to say that if we want Hungary to remain Hungary, then we really have to provide the population that is Hungarian, and not rely on bringing in large numbers of people outside, because as Europe has found, and this has been admitted by all the serious students of it, what European governments wanted was workers. What they got was people. And the people then are either going to be absorbed into the population, they're going to be assimilated, they're going to become genuine citizens of that country, not simply legally so, but emotionally, morally, and in other ways, or they're not. And in addition to mass migration, European governments and European intellectuals have become very nervous about the idea of asking people to assimilate. It's not something that they were nervous about in the last century, in the 19th century, and first half of the 20th century. And those migrations were successfully absorbed. They strengthened rather than weakened the societies in which they happened. But that cannot happen if we encourage people to remain, so to speak, separate in every sense other than the legal sense, and that's something which the Hungarians recognise, and which, to some extent, is recognised in debate in other countries.
The Hungarian cultural and political environment has been shaped by a conservative government that is comfortable with utilising institutional power. A recent government grant of some 1.2 billion euros to the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, or the MCC, a residential college that offers conservative students fellowships, stipends and networking events, is characteristic of this strategy. The college was founded in the 1990s to train Hungary's post-communist elite and is unabashedly patriotic and conservative in its emphasis. There is this sort of idea that somehow this is also a desire to create a new elite going forward, you know, that is more, if you like, conservative, or is that fair? Or?
I think that such values like you are part of a community, you have to know your history and understand where you are coming from, that you have to be proud that you are Hungarian, or you can proud that you are German or English or whatever. You have to take care about this community. The future of this community is important. If these values are conservative, then yes, but I think these are just normal values which are probably for everybody are important, and I know that there are developments in the world which are going against it. But I think it's very important that there are ideas and values that are they are proven, that they are working, that they are important, that they can fulfill the life and help the life of the people. And I think we have to keep up with such values, and we have to give them further to and to show probably for the students what kind of values are there, and then they can decide.
I mean, I would say that makes you almost unique in, well, at least in Europe and Britain, in the sense that you're actually sort of trying to impart values that are not, you know, necessarily just woke ones. I mean, how much would you say in students' lives, not in MCC but generally young people, are those sort of ideologies, are they seeping in any way? I mean, you know, through the media or?
Of course, so our students and Hungarian kids are watching Netflix.
Yes.
They play the video games. They use the smartphones with all the apps and watching YouTube, and it's you can do not very much against it, and I'm not sure you have to do something against it, but to give the opportunity to talk about values that are for long-term values, and that were successful and important in the last decades and the last hundreds of years. It's very important, and I think very useful. Of course, Hungary is not as far as some universities in the United Kingdom or the United States. So in Hungary it's not an everyday topic that we should open a gender toilet or not, or we don't have diversity offices. And I think it's good so. So we are not as far in this wokeness as let's say other countries from this Anglo-Saxon world. But you can feel step by step that it's coming, and discussions are starting about this. And because of this as well, it's very important to see and understand and distinguish between values.
Yes. It's a kind of conservative hub, not simply and only a college, a higher educational institution, but also a place for people and ideas to meet who are brave enough to consider themselves conservatives. In many respects, you need to be very brave actually to declare yourself a conservative in face of the tide you see coming from the West, which is claiming to be liberal, but in face of the the original definition and sense of liberalism, and that is the tolerance of other opinion and worldview, is increasingly monolithic and monopolizing, trying to reject everything which is non-liberal. I believe the accusation that illiberal democracy means something anti-Western, we are able to demonstrate through MCC, among others, that illiberal means non-liberal in the sense the Western European liberals consider themselves. It's common sense, it's conservative, it's reaching out to people, and most characteristically, it is accepting that there are different and colliding views about the future of the world, the future of Europe, instead of accepting that there is only one way ahead.
I mean, when I was asking you about how you approach literature as well, the thing is, as you've alluded to it, is that in British universities now, of course, various different preoccupations to do with race, gender, class, sex, they pretty much are the overriding motives, it seems, now in teaching. That wouldn't be the case here. I mean, would you put trigger warnings on books?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I think, you know, the whole point about literature is that you learn about other eras and other ways of thinking, and that, you know, perhaps life isn't always very fair or pleasant. So that's one of the things that literature can do very well, is to give you another experience. I mean, it's one thing that you've had a very comfortable life, which is, if you've had it, is very lucky. But I mean, it's important to realise what else has gone on in the past and what is still going on in other parts of the world. So no, absolutely not. Who knows, it may come, but I certainly don't.
I noticed we're sitting here in something called the Scruton Cafe. Now, can I ask, did you know, I mean, all these busts here, look, all around Roger Scruton, we interviewed him on my channel. Did you know about him before you came here, or did you find out about him when you got here?
I got to learn about him quite early on in my high school studies as well.
Yeah.
Not in depth, but I think that I had a basic idea about who he was.
Yeah.
And certainly I didn't have that much idea about his importance or
Yeah.
maybe about his relevance.
Yeah.
But as I came here, I realized that the impact he had, not just on the British society, but on conservatives all over the world,
Yes.
I feel it even more today.
Yes. And how about you? Do you know who he was?
Before my university studies, I didn't know about him, but actually when I came here, and so first I heard of him on a political philosophy lesson last year. Yeah.
Yes. And do you think his particular values and philosophy, they resonate with you? I mean, would you say that you are quite typical people of your age, would you say, or not, in Hungary? Or have you not given it any thought?
With regards to, let's say, having children, raising them up, I'd say, yeah, I share his values. On economic terms, I still feel that I need to develop my economic thinking and my ideals on this regard.
Right.
But if we stick to the everyday routines,
Yes.
what it means to, let's say, go to a church or be part of a community, and what it means to be Christian in Hungary, then in this case, I'd say that, yeah, I also feel that I also have a sense of duty to protect what my, let's say, my parents told me and what my community told me.
Yes, yes.
So I believe that Scruton had an important impact in that.
Yes, yes, definitely. You know, from what I've been, you know, seeing and speaking to people, it's quite important that it imparts various values to you. What would you say they are?
Family and faith they play a crucial role in MCC, and that is pretty much embodied in our lectures and presentations. Because it's even fascinating for me that every second day or third day we have presentations and lectures that we can attend here, and we usually talk about conservative values, what it means to be a conservative in Europe in the 21st century.
Yes.
What is the role of family? Who we are at this point, and how do we live in the academic level, all these challenges. And I think it's very important to talk about these values these days, as these institutions are pretty much under attack these days, so it's important to have conversations about these things.
Currently, the Western civilization is not in a good shape. Western civilization itself was very dominant in the previous centuries. But currently it seems that in the 21st century things might be changing. New competitors emerging, new challenges are, even global challenges are here in the front yards. So, and I think everybody, every country's elite is desperately looking for solutions or answers. How to tackle these challenges, how to answer to these questions. And there are two different, and obviously there are two different type of answers. One type of people, they are saying that that's the liberal approach, according to my understanding, is that the values which what we were taking seriously in the last decades, those values are outdated and they block us. And the reason why we are not finding the proper answer is because we are stuck with these values, these traditional old type of values, like nation states, like traditional families, like traditional way of market, and so on and so on. Traditional biological roles and whatever. And their answer is that we have to reinvent everything. We have to find a new value system. We have to find something which is not linked to the past. And if we find that, and if the society, the economy, the whole political structure is changing toward that direction, then we will have the answer and we will emerge again. What the conservatives are saying is just the opposite. They are saying that look, these are the values which made us successful. Christianity, nationhood, just traditional families with children, ethical, moral values based on Judeo-Christian heritage, traditional concept of sex, gender, and education, or traditional concept of free market and the involvement of state. And our problem is that we are turning away from these values. So what should be done is to turn back to these values and to use it also in 21st century circumstances.
So here, I think, if we looked at this country here, we would say about it, you know, this is a place which has had a much tougher time than we have. But it's better than it was. And one of the things that I notice about it is it's a bit more, in a curious way, like we used to be. And those aspects of their life, they value, and as we once valued. And it's extraordinary to me that a country which, in a sense, they look up to, in many respects, is a country that is a country which I am now finding as saying, I feel very comfortable here.
We are for freedom, first of all. Then we are from our belief for God. We are for our nation, and we are for the families. These values are not just the values of the center-right in Europe, but also across the ocean in the United States. And something now is on the move over there as well. So we believe that there will be a revival, because we believe in the West, we believe in the European culture and civilization. Christianity is such a source that it has been able to renew itself historically many times. And probably now we are at a pregnancy, and this kind of renewal is coming.
A fine example of the restoration of pride and identity in Hungarian culture is this, the National Houseman Programme. A 10-year scheme to revamp Budapest's castle district, This has seen the reconstruction of the public spaces and buildings which were partly destroyed and fell into disrepair during communist occupation. There is something in this project that speaks more broadly of the changes taking place in Hungary. It speaks of the restoration of identity, of beauty, of a respect and love for the country's heritage, of the things that bind people together as a culture, a community, a country, but not at the expense of dialogue or free thinking. I, for one, have been struck by the thriving open-mindedness and exchange of ideas in Hungarian institutions, especially when compared with the stultifying atmosphere we have come used to in Western Europe.
Hungary is a country whose past is riddled with ideological failures. There is therefore a recognition and love of what is tried and tested, as well as a justified skepticism towards new and potentially destructive ideas. In doing this, they have done the West's conservative movement considerable service. For too long, conservatives across Europe and America have shied away from fighting their battles, from abstract values through to actual public policy. By putting conservative values to work, Viktor Orbán and his government perhaps have created a tangible, workable alternative to the mainstream of the West. Perhaps this, better than anything else, explains the ferocity of their critics. They fear that in the face of the influx of illegal migrants, the toppling of statues, the compromising of our universities and institutions, and the sheer relentless self-loathing, Western onlookers might be inspired to look at what Hungary has been doing.